Here is something most people don't know about Callaway County, Missouri. A real estate developer marketed a private lake located in the southern quarter of the county to 114 families as a community amenity. They named it Settlers Cove. They put drone footage of it in their sales brochures. They printed the words "private lake access" in every listing, 114 times, at prices ranging from $379,000 to $552,000. The developer never owned the lake. Not a single square foot of the lake bed. Not the docks. Not the boat ramps. Not the gravel paths leading down to the water. Every nail they drove into that shoreline was driven into someone else's land. That someone was my grandmother. And when she died and left everything to me, I inherited not just a farmhouse and 280 acres of central Missouri bottomland. I inherited the receipts for every lie Hargrove Residential Group had ever told. My name is Dina Callaway Marsh. I'm a land management consultant. I assess water rights, agricultural easements, boundary disputes, and deed chains for a living. I have been doing this for 11 years, and I want to be direct with you about something before we go any further. I am not the hero of this story in the way people usually expect. I won, but not cleanly. And the question I've been living with since the settlement closed is whether there was ever a version of this that could have been clean, or whether I was always going to leave somebody standing in the wreckage. That's the question I want you to sit with today. Not just what happened, but whether what I did was right. Let's start at the very beginning. My grandmother, Ruth Callaway, bought her property in 1988. She paid $141,000 for 280 acres of bottomland that the selling family had given up on after 3 consecutive bad crop years. The western half of the property was heavy with clay, which made it difficult to farm conventionally. The eastern pastures were productive, good for cattle and hay, but it was the center of the property that nobody could figure out what to do with. There was a lake, not a pond. The county assessor's records from 1988 called it a natural water feature, estimated seasonal. Ruth called it Millbrook Lake, after the spring that fed it, and she knew from the first summer she worked the land that it was never going seasonal. It was cold and clear and deep, and it didn't shrink in August the way the county thought it would. She stocked it with base and crappie. She built a dock, one single dock, 20 feet long, with a weathered bench at the end, and she fished from it every morning she was well enough to walk down to the water. I spent summers there from the time I was 7 years old. My mother's family had scattered across the country by then, my mother in St. Louis, her brother in Phoenix, cousins I barely knew in Florida, but Ruth kept the farm the way she kept everything, steady and without apology. She raised cattle on the eastern pastures. She leased the southern fields to a neighboring farmer for soybean production. She maintained every fence line herself until she was 72. She never subdivided. She never sold an acre. She never borrowed against the land, not once in 35 years. When I came to her farm in late August, 2 weeks after her funeral, I came as her executor, her only grandchild who had stayed in Missouri, and as the new owner of everything she had built. I had a moving truck, a list of structural repairs the farmhouse needed, and a recording of her voice on my phone that I hadn't been able to delete yet. I did not come expecting to walk into a 5-year real estate fraud. I had been at the farm for 4 hours when 2 men came through the back gate. They didn't knock at the farmhouse. They didn't announce themselves. They came through the wooden gate on the western side of the property, the gate that opens toward the lake, and crossed the yard like they'd done it before, which, I would later learn, they had. The taller one was named Brent Fielding. He introduced himself as Vice President of Community Operations for Hargrove Residential Group. The shorter one, younger, maybe 30, with the practiced calm of someone who had delivered uncomfortable news many times before, was called Seth Poole. Seth was the managing director of Lakeview Solutions, LLC, the property management company contracted to run the Settlers Cove HOA. They were both wearing matching branded polos, navy blue, white embroidered lettering. Settlers Cove HOA, Callaway County's premier lake community. Brent explained that they had heard about Ruth's passing and wanted to extend their condolences. Then, with a pivot so clean it had clearly been rehearsed, he said they also wanted to discuss the ongoing recreational arrangement between the Callaway estate and Settlers Cove. I said, "What arrangement?" Brent said that Ruth had been an informal community partner since Settlers Cove was developed in 2020, allowing residents lake access under a good faith understanding with Hargrove that had never been formally documented due to, and he actually said this, the informal nature of rural landowner relationships. I asked him to show me any document, any communication, anything in writing. He said it had been a verbal agreement. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said that I was a land management consultant, that I had spent 11 years reading deeds and easement agreements and property contracts, and that I was intimately familiar with the difference between a legally enforceable property right and a story someone tells because they're hoping the new owner won't check, and that I would need to see documentation before this conversation went any further. Seth spoke then. He said the HOA was prepared to offer a fair market easement payment in exchange for formal, permanent lake access rights. He said the 114 families in Settlers Cove had been using Millbrook Lake for nearly 5 years. He mentioned prescriptive easement. He said it with the specific, deliberate weight of someone who had been coached on exactly when to introduce the phrase. I thanked them both and told them to leave my property. I want you to think about the specific audacity of that moment. 2 men from a company that had built $47 million worth of homes around my grandmother's lake, a lake they had never purchased, never contracted for, never acquired any legal right to, were standing in her yard explaining to me why I should accommodate them. They left. I went inside, I made coffee, and then I pulled up the Callaway County Property Records database and I started working. I didn't sleep much for the next week. What I found, over 6 days of pulling original records, ordering certified copies from the county recorder's office, and cross-referencing 3 separate surveys, one from 1988, one from 2004, and one I commissioned myself, was this. In 2019, Hargrove Residential Group purchased 195 acres of clay-heavy farmland directly to the west of Ruth's property. They paid $2.1 million for it. This was land that had been sitting undeveloped for 30 years because of its soil composition, which made traditional agriculture uneconomical. Hargrove wasn't farming it. They had a different plan. Between 2019 and 2021, they developed what would become Settlers Cove, 114 single-family homes in a planned residential subdivision marketed as a lakefront community. The development gross sales totaled approximately $47 million. Home prices started at $379,000. The lakefront adjacent lots, the ones within visual range of Millbrook Lake, sold for $492,000 to $552,000. Every single listing mentioned the lake. Every brochure showed the lake. The website for Settlers Cove featured aerial drone footage that opened on the lake at sunrise and ran for 40 seconds before cutting to the model home interior. There was a page titled "Your Lake Life Awaits," with photographs of kayakers and fishing boats and a family on a dock watching the sunset. Now, here is the part where I need you to follow me carefully, because this is where the story pivots from a dispute into something more serious. Hargrove's western property boundary, documented in their own plat, filed with Callaway County in 2020, stops at the fence line that has marked the edge of the Callaway property since 1988. The legal boundary had never moved. Ruth's deed described her land with precise meets and bounds language that had been unchanged through 2 title transfers and 1 estate administration. The lake bed and a 30-foot riparian buffer on all sides belonged to the Callaway parcel. Always had. Hargrove had platted their subdivision right up to that boundary line. And then they had kept going. The 17 dock structures, the 2 concrete boat ramp pads, the gravel maintenance paths, the electrical conduits running power to the dock lighting, all of it crossed the property line onto Callaway land by between 14 and 31 feet, depending on the structure. 17 separate trespassery structures, built without permission, on my grandmother's property. I've told stories on this channel where the injustice is clear and the path forward is obvious. This wasn't one of those stories, because 114 families had bought their homes believing lake access was real, legal, and permanent. They weren't the ones who had lied. They were, in a very real sense, victims of the same fraud I was trying to untangle. And that made every decision I made from that point forward more complicated than I expected. Before I contacted an attorney, I wanted to understand the full structure of what I was looking at. Because Seth Poole mentioning prescriptive easement in a casual property meeting wasn't accidental. That kind of language is planted. I started with the HOA's corporate documents. Settlers Cove HOA had been established by Hargrove Residential Group in 2020 as part of the subdivision's formation. That's standard practice. Developers create the HOA, write the governing documents, and control it during the development period before transitioning authority to homeowners once the community reaches occupancy thresholds. Settlers Cove had hit those thresholds in 2022, and formal governance had transferred to an elected homeowner board. But Lakeview Solutions, LLC, the management company Seth Poole represented, the one with the branded polo shirts and the practiced prescriptive easement speech, was something else entirely. Lakeview Solutions, LLC, had been registered with the Missouri Secretary of State in 2021. Its registered agent was the same law firm that had incorporated Hargrove Residential Group a decade earlier. Among its listed managing members, a name I recognized from Hargrove's own corporate filings, Preston Hargrove, the developer's younger brother. The HOA's independent property management company was owned by the developer's sibling, and the contract between the HOA and Lakeview Solutions, LLC, a recreational asset management and maintenance agreement signed in 2021 and renewed annually, paid Lakeview Solutions $9,200 per month to maintain the lake, the docks, the boat ramps, and the waterfront common areas. $9,200 a month. For managing infrastructure built on land they didn't own, paid by homeowners who believed they were paying for legitimate services. Over 4 years, that contract had generated approximately $441,600 in management fees, flowing from the pockets of families who had trusted the process, into a company owned by the developer's brother, for the maintenance of trespassery structures on my grandmother's property. I printed everything, put it in a binder, and called an attorney named Margaret Tongue at a real estate and property rights firm in Columbia. I had worked with Margaret on an agricultural easement case the previous year. She was methodical, unsentimental, and not easily surprised. I sent her the binder before I called. When she picked up, I gave her 20 minutes to read. When she called back, she was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then she said, "Dana, they sold $47 million worth of homes using your grandmother's lake as the centerpiece, and they never owned it." I said yes. She said, "Okay, here's how we build this." Margaret and I spent 4 weeks preparing before we filed anything or sent a single letter. I want to explain why, because the patience mattered. There were 114 families in Settlers Cove. Most had spent their savings on these homes. Many had children who had grown up swimming in Millbrook Lake. They had boats. They had annual fishing permits they renewed with the HOA. They had planned their retirement around a lake life that a developer had manufactured without ever owning the underlying asset. Whatever we did, the strategy had to be precise about who was responsible. We were going after Hargrove Residential Group and Lakeview Solutions, LLC. We were not going after homeowners. Margaret built the case on 3 legal pillars. First, continuing trespass. Under Missouri Revised Statutes, Section 537.353, the placement of permanent structures on another's land without authorization constitutes a continuing trespass, with damages accruing for each month the trespass remains unresolved. 17 structures. 48 months of accrual. Using a fair rental value of $2,800 per month per structure for premium lakefront land in Callaway County, supported by 3 comparable market analyses, the trespass damages alone came to approximately $2.3 million. Second, fraudulent misrepresentation under the Missouri Merchandising Practices Act. Hargrove had marketed Settlers Cove with lake access as a material feature. If they knew, and we believe the evidence showed they did, that lake access was not theirs to offer, every representation made to induce a home purchase was potentially fraudulent. The waterfront premium on the lake-facing lots alone averaged $62,000 per property above comparable non-lake adjacent homes in the county. Across the 114 transactions that represented potential fraudulent inducement damages in the range of $7 million. Third, breach of fiduciary duty. Lakeview Solutions, LLC, operating as the HOA's fiduciary property manager, had collected fees to administer assets they knew or should have known were not legitimately part of the association's property. That created exposure for Preston Hargrove personally. On the prescriptive easement question, the threat Seth Poole had planted, Margaret dismissed it efficiently. Missouri requires 10 years of open, continuous, notorious, and adverse use to establish prescriptive easement under established case law. Settlers Cove had existed for less than 5 years. The doctrine was unavailable to them on the calendar alone. We sent the demand letter on the second Tuesday in October. It went to Hargrove Residential Group, Lakeview Solutions, LLC, and Preston Hargrove individually. It outlined all 3 legal claims, cited the specific statutes and damage calculations, and made 3 demands: removal of all trespassory structures within 90 days, total damages of $9.3 million, and full, written disclosure to all 114 Settlers Cove homeowners of the actual legal status of Millbrook Lake and their lake access rights. We also filed a notice of lis pendens, a pending dispute notice, with the Callaway County Recorder's Office. This created a recorded cloud on every dock structure in Settlers Cove, making them legally unmarketable until the matter was resolved. Anyone selling a home in Settlers Cove would now have to disclose the dispute to buyers. In a lakefront community where the lake was the product, this was effectively a freeze on the real estate market within the development. They responded in 9 days, with 4 attorneys. Hargrove's legal response was built around 2 arguments. The first was prescriptive easement. Their attorneys argued that Ruth Callaway had knowingly and continuously allowed Settlers Cove residents to use the lake from 2020 onward without objection, creating an implied license that had begun to ripen into an easement. Margaret filed a 12-page rebuttal citing the statutory 10-year requirement. Missouri law is unambiguous. A 5-year implied license doesn't become a prescriptive right just because the people using it would prefer that it did. The second argument was different, more dangerous initially. Hargrove's team claimed that a 2019 email exchange between their development team and Ruth Calloway constituted an oral easement agreement supported by written confirmation of intent. They attached 11 emails. The correspondence, they said, I showed Ruth agreeing in principle to lake access in exchange for ongoing maintenance of her property's western fence line, a fence that Hargrove would repair and replace in perpetuity as consideration. I read those emails at Margaret's office. My grandmother did not use email. Ruth Calloway was 81 years old when she died. She had a landline telephone that still sat on the kitchen counter. She had a handwritten address book. She had never owned a computer or a smartphone. Her farmhand of 14 years, a man named Gerald, who still leased the eastern pastures, had never seen her use any electronic device beyond a television remote. Her physician's records contained not a single instance of electronic patient portal use. Her estate documents, prepared by her longtime attorney in Fulton, had been signed in person, in ink, she with no digital components. I had phone records going back 7 years. Not one call to Hargrove. Not one call to any number associated with their corporate offices or law firm. The email address Hargrove's attorneys had attributed to Ruth, rcalloway1942@millbrookmail.com, had been registered in March 2022. Ruth had been diagnosed with the illness that would take her life in September 2021. By March 2022, she was receiving in-home care 3 days a week and had not driven herself anywhere in 5 months. Someone had created an email account in my dead grandmother's name, almost a year after she became seriously ill, and sent fabricated correspondence to manufacture the appearance of a lake access agreement. I want you to hold that, because there's a version of this story where a corporation fights back hard and pushes aggressive legal theories and makes you spend a year in depositions. That's one thing. What Hargrove did was create false evidence using the identity of an elderly woman who couldn't defend herself. And that changes what this story is about. Margaret filed an emergency motion for sanctions with the Calloway County Circuit Court the same afternoon we confirmed the email account's registration date. We attached affidavits from Gerald, from Ruth's physician, from her estate attorney, and from a digital forensics analyst who had examined the email headers. The metadata showed the messages had been drafted and sent from an IP address registered to a property in Columbia, Missouri, the same city where Hargrove Residential Group maintained its corporate offices. 3 weeks after the sanctions motion was filed, Hargrove's lead counsel withdrew from the case. The Missouri Attorney General's office contacted Margaret the following week. 2 Settlers Cove homeowners had found the lease pendants filing in the county records and had begun asking their own questions. The AG's Consumer Protection Division was opening an investigation under the Missouri Merchandising Practices Act, Chapter 407. Brent Fielding, the man who had walked through my grandmother's gate with a rehearsed speech about informal rural arrangements, resigned from Hargrove Residential Group 7 days later. Preston Hargrove retained a criminal defense attorney, and the litigation had now fractured into 3 simultaneous tracks: my civil suit against Hargrove, the AG's consumer fraud investigation, and a class action that formed among Settlers Cove homeowners faster than I expected. A couple named the Deckers, he was a retired county highway supervisor, she taught 4th grade, had been among the first to find the Ellis pendants. They hired an attorney in Jefferson City named Carolyn Price, who moved with focused speed. Within 8 weeks, Price had 91 of the 114 homeowners enrolled in a class action against Hargrove Residential Group for fraudulent misrepresentation, seeking either full rescission of their home purchases or damages equal to the lake access premium they had been fraudulently induced to pay. The homeowner class action's legal theory depended partly on establishing that lake access had never been legitimately available, which meant, in an indirect but significant way, my ownership claim was the evidentiary foundation of their case. My evidence that Hargrove had no right to the lake was also the evidence that the homeowners had been defrauded. Carolyn Price called Margaret in late November. She wanted to coordinate. We met in a conference room in Columbia. Margaret and I on one side, Price and 4 homeowner plaintiffs on the other. A retired electrical contractor. A woman who had moved her mother into a ground floor unit specifically because of the flat lakeside terrain. A couple in their early 40s who had stretched their budget to the absolute limit to buy in Settlers Cove because they'd wanted their son, who used a wheelchair, to have easy water access. None of them had known. None of them had had any reason to suspect. They had looked at the brochures, spoken to the sales agents, paid their prices, and believed what they were told. They were people who had done everything right and been deceived. I'm not going to tell you that was easy to sit across from. It wasn't. We reached a coordination agreement. I would not seek emergency injunctive relief to physically close lake access during the litigation. Families could keep using the lake. Boats could stay in the slips. Kids could swim. In exchange, the homeowner class would not oppose my underlying ownership claim and would support our damages calculation against Hargrove. It meant 91 families spent the holidays uncertain about what their homes were worth and whether their largest asset had a cloud on its title through no fault of their own. I think about that every time someone asks me whether I handled this the right way. Hargrove's third legal team opened settlement negotiations in January. Their first offer, $1.8 million, perpetual easement, rejected in 24 hours. Their second offer, $4.1 million, easement with Lakeview Solutions, LLC, retained as manager. Rejected immediately, letting Preston Hargrove's company continue profiting from my grandmother's lake as a part of the settlement wasn't a compromise. It was the fraud continuing under different paperwork. Their third offer came 12 days before our trial date, $5.6 million total. A perpetual, non-transferable recreational easement for current Settlers Cove homeowners only. Full removal of Lakeview Solutions, LLC from any lake management role. A public written acknowledgement of the misrepresentation in their marketing materials. And a $210,000 contribution to a lakebed environmental remediation fund, addressing documented sedimentation damage from the construction period. We negotiated 8 additional terms over 4 days. We settled on February 3rd. Total payment to me, $5.6 million. After Margaret's fees and litigation costs, I received $3.9 million. The perpetual recreational easement covers current Settlers Cove homeowners, the people who live there right now. It is expressly non-transferable. When a home sells, the new buyer does not inherit lake rights. They would need to negotiate a new, separate agreement with me. Given that the easement's non-transferability will become a material disclosure item in every future real estate transaction in that development, the effective market value of the lake-facing homes has already shifted. The Lakebed Remediation Fund, $210,000, was placed under an independent environmental trust, with a university fisheries program contracted to assess and restore the lakebed's basin crappie populations, which a preliminary survey had found were declining due to construction runoff sedimentation. Lakeview Solutions, LLC, was permanently removed from all management roles in Settlers Cove. Preston Hargrove signed personally. The AG's consent decree, negotiated separately, required Hargrove Residential Group to pay $3.1 million into a homeowner remediation fund. Direct payments to the 91 class action participants, prorated against the lake access premium they had paid. The Deckers received $58,000. The couple with the son who used a wheelchair received $71,000. It was something. It was not everything they deserved. The fabricated email evidence was referred to the Callaway County Prosecutor's Office and the Missouri Bar for separate action. As of when I recorded this, that matter is still moving through the process. 3 weeks after the settlement closed, I drove out to Millbrook Lake on a Sunday morning in late February. It was cold. The water was low and gray, the color of old pewter. Ice had formed in the shallow corners along the northern bank. There was a man sitting at the end of the long dock, the one Hargrove had built in 2020 on my grandmother's land. He was old, maybe 75, in a heavy coat, with a thermos and a rod in the water. He wasn't catching anything. He didn't seem to care. I stood at the top of the bank for a while, long enough that he saw me and raised his hand. I raised mine. I thought about going down to explain the easement to him, that his access was his, but not heritable, that when he sold, the lake would be mine to negotiate again, that the dock he was sitting on had been built by a company that had fabricated an email from a dead woman to try to take what never belonged to them. I didn't go down. I got back in my truck and drove to the farmhouse and made coffee at Ruth's kitchen table. Here is what I know. I won. By any legal measure, I won decisively. Hargrove is under multiple investigations. Homeowners received some compensation. My grandmother's land is titled correctly and legally protected. I have resources I didn't have in August. Here is what I keep coming back to. The easement's non-transferability means that eventually, as people sell, as families move, as years pass, the access rights in Settlers Cove will erode, lot by lot, year by year, until someday there's a family who bought that house for the lake and discovers the lake isn't theirs anymore, and I will be the reason. Some people I've told this story to say, I was right, that property rights are property rights, that I didn't create this problem and it wasn't my responsibility to absorb the cost of solving it for people who weren't responsible either. Others say I should have offered a clean, a permanent, transferable easement and taken less money. That protecting 114 families from a fraud they didn't commit was worth more than the additional leverage I had. I don't know who's correct. I genuinely don't. I've sat on both sides of that argument in the dark at 2 in the morning, and I can't find the floor. My grandmother bought this land because it was cheap and nobody else wanted it. She spent 35 years building it into something worth keeping. She fished a lake that 12 lawyers now know the deed history of in ways she never imagined. She sat at the end of that dock in early morning, quiet, and watched the water move. I go out there sometimes, now that the weather's turned. I sit on the bank above the water, not on the dock, not yet, and I watch the light come up. The bass are starting to return to the shallows now that the remediation work has begun. The silt is clearing. The water is cold and clear and deep, the way it always was. The legal description in the Callaway County deed records reads exactly as it did in 1988. Millbrook Lake, all riparian rights reserved, 280 acres. Fee simple. Dina Callaway Marsh, owner of record. Ruth would have understood the fight. I think she would have been proud of it. I'm less certain she would have been proud of every choice I made within it, and I think she would have been honest enough to say so. She was that kind of woman. This is HOA Nightmares. We don't do easy endings here. If this story made you argue with yourself, if you're sitting in the comments right now trying to figure out what the right answer was, that's the point. Drop it down below. I read every one. New story next week. Subscribe and stay with us.